Good morning, and you're very welcome to another Signpost Series webinar, our very first of 2025, and I hope the new year is treating you well. And we have a great lineup for the new year ahead, and looking forward to you coming along every Friday at 9:30 as always. So look, today we have a very interesting topic. We're going to discuss invasive species and overview for farmers. And if you're walking land during the year, would you recognize invasive species on your farm? And if so, what would you do? And more importantly, what impact do invasive species have on our environment? And we're delighted to be joined by Kate Moore, Invasive Species Engagement Officer with the National Biodiversity Data Centre. Good morning, Kate. You're very welcome to the webinar.
Morning, Cathal. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and where are you today, Kate?
I'm based down in the National Biodiversity Data Centre in Waterford City.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Dull and cloudy down there as well, it is?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, same here, unfortunately. But
Yeah.
look, the sun will come out eventually. And we're also joined by Ivan Kelly, our own Teagasc Biodiversity Specialist, who's going to assist us with the questions later on today. Ivan, how are you keeping?
Good, Cathal. Good morning.
Good, good. Where are you based today, Ivan?
I'm over in Galway, sunny Galway.
Yeah, sunny
uh,
Galway, yeah. Lovely. And Kate, I suppose before we get into your presentation, maybe you'll tell us a little bit about your work.
Yeah, so I work as the Invasive Species Engagement Officer here in the data centre. So my role is about raising awareness on invasive species and trying to get people to take action on the ground.
Lovely. And just to remind everybody that the podcast version of the Signpost Series webinar is also available to listen. So if you're on the move, it'll keep you up to date, and it's available on all podcast platforms. And not to forget that we're going to record today's session, and please do submit your questions to the Q&A tab. And Ivan will be there to assist on questions and keep them coming in, because as we always say, the more questions that come in, the better conversation we'll have at the end. So, Kate, I suppose with that, maybe you'll start, maybe get your presentation. You can share your slides there.
Yep.
And this is an interesting one, and it's very farmer focused today. So it'll be interesting to see what farmers can look out for and what we can do about it. Okay, Kate, so whenever you're ready.
Perfect. So today I'll be giving an overview of invasive species in the context of farms. So I will talk about, sorry, now my slides are not moving. I will discuss what invasive species are, how they can be spread, and what impacts they may have. Then I'll take a look at some of the common species that you might find on Irish farms. And we'll also look at ways in which you can prevent the spread of invasive species. And as Cathal said, we'll take questions at the end. So invasive species, what do we mean about what they are? So an invasive species is a plant, animal, or pathogen that is not native to Ireland. It has been brought here either on purpose or by accident by people. Once here, not only do they thrive, but they also can spread further. And unfortunately, they have negative impacts on the environment, the economy, and the way in which we live. So how do these species spread? Well, they can be imported for planting in gardens from where they can disperse, or they could be kept as pets, which could end up escaping and being released. They can also arrive here accidentally as hitchhikers on our vehicles, our belongings, or as contaminants in different products. And we see that there's an increasing trend in the introduction of these species to Ireland, which is linked to the increased movement of people and goods. And this is a trend that occurs globally. So what impacts do invasive species have? Well, after habitat loss, invasive species are the second biggest driver of biodiversity decline. And they do this by outcompeting native species for resources. They can displace local plant and animal communities, and they can change whole ecosystems, affecting ecosystem function and the services that they provide. Some even pose a risk to our health, and they can also impact the economy, recreation, and our culture. So we see here on the left a photograph of Loch Corrib, and this is the lake prior to being infested with Lagersiphon major, also known as curly waterweed, which is an aquatic invasive weed. And if we look at the photo on the right, we see that the level of impact which the species has on the lake and the habitat itself. We also know that many invasive species prey on our native animals. So like American mink is known to prey on our native bird species. Some aquatic weeds can block waterways, and this affects navigation of boats and will impact sporting activities like angling and paddle sports. So we know that invasive species also impact farmers. So for those of you who may be on the acres scheme, the presence of invasive species land may impact your payment. Invasive species like Japanese knotweed are often found in hedgerows and can be very difficult to deal with. So it's important to know as a landowner that there are some invasive species that are regulated, and it's actually an offence to let them spread. Management of these invasive species is the responsibility of the landowner. So if there was a species on public land or on a public road, that would be the responsibility of the local authority, but if it's on your land, it's your responsibility. You can find information on legislation and policy on our website, but if you have specific queries relating to the regulations, it would be best to direct those to the National Parks and Wildlife Service. So let's discuss some of the common invasive species that we find on Irish farms. So to begin, giant hogweed is usually found along water courses. It's quite a large plant. It can grow up to 5 meters in height. It has large leaves that are sharply divided. It also has large hollow stems, and these can have purple blotches and bristles. And it has a parsnip-like taproot. The plant has large umbrella-shaped flowers, which will appear between June and September. And it has seed heads that will shed the seeds in autumn time as the plant dies off. In winter, all that will remain will be the dead seed head and the stem. So it's important not to confuse giant hogweed with our native common hogweed species. Common hogweed or native hogweed is a much smaller plant. It has smaller stems and rounder leaves. And in comparison to giant hogweed, where the leaves are much more serrated. And in general, we kind of describe giant hogweed as a much more aggressive looking plant. So how does a species spread? So it can produce up to 50,000 seeds, which can be easily dispersed by water or wind, or even along road corridors. It shades out native species, and it has the ability to destabilize riverbanks, which will impact on water quality. It is a health hazard, so the sap that the plant produces can cause nasty burns, which can become reactivated by the sunlight for several years thereafterwards. So it's very important not to touch the plant unless you're wearing appropriate PPE. So in terms of undertaking management, herbicide treatment would be the most effective, but you must use a herbicide that is approved for use near water. It's recommended to collect the seed head because the aim is to eliminate the seed bank in the soil. And this can take several years, so treatment may take a few years to eradicate the species. It would be important to consider a catchment approach to management. So what that means is working with landowners upstream of your land to ensure that your land doesn't become reinfested later as the species spreads. Many of you would be familiar with Japanese knotweed. You might have seen the road signs where the councils are controlling the plant. It can be found on farms too, particularly along hedgerows. So it can grow up to 3 meters in height. Its leaves are shield-shaped. It has a bamboo-like stem that's arranged in a zigzag pattern, and it produces small, creamy white flowers. So how does it spread? So beneath the ground, Japanese knotweed forms a system of roots and rhizomes. So a rhizome is just an underground stem. And when these become fragmented, they can be carried by water or soil and this can start new growth. The plant can also be spread through the dispersal of waste material. It's a very problematic species. Again, it outcompetes our native species. It causes riverbank erosion, and it even has the ability to cause structural damage to buildings. So we see that Japanese knotweed appears differently throughout the year. So in springtime, spear-shaped shoots emerge. And then in the summertime, the plant has herbaceous green leaves. And in late summer and into autumn, small white flowers will appear. Then in wintertime, the plant dies off, and all that will remain will be the dead canes. And you can see the zigzag pattern on those dead canes in wintertime. There are other knotweed species, and these should be treated in the exact same way as Japanese knotweed. When it comes to management, it would be best to seek professional advice from an environmental consultant, and it's important to have a site-specific plan. So any of the management I discussed today is their general recommendations, but whenever you're taking under management, it needs to be specific to your own farm and your own site, depending on the level of infestation that you have. With Japanese knotweed, it's important that you do not cut it because this could spread it further. With the most environmentally friendly way to treat knotweed is with herbicide, but this can take several years. So it could take 2-3 years for nearly up to 5 years of treatment, depending on how big the infestation is. So the herbicide can be applied directly to the leaves, or for larger infestations or those near water, stem injection is advised. The alternative is excavation, so excavating the plant and all the soil material containing the roots, but this is very costly and disruptive to the environment. It is a quicker solution though if you are maybe developing on your farm and there is knotweed present and you need to move ahead. This would be a quicker solution, but it is very costly, and you might require a license from the National Parks and Wildlife Service to move any of that material or contaminated soil. So Himalayan balsam is another species that we find along watercourses, and it grows up to 3 meters in height. It has green leaves that are serrated. It has a brown-green hollow stem, and it has pink trumpet-shaped flowers with wide petals. And these are quite attractive to pollinators, and we sometimes see that beekeepers like to plant Himalayan balsam, but we advise not to do that because the negative consequences on the environment outweigh any good that they do for the pollinators. So how do these species spread? So they have these seed pods that actually explode when they're touched, and that triggers other seed pods on the plant to explode. And that releases the seeds, and they can spread very far from the plant. Then the seeds can then get dispersed by water and travel down waterways. So again, this is a very problematic species. We see in wintertime when the plant dies back, it leaves bare banks which are exposed to erosion, and this destabilizes riverbanks and leads to sedimentation, where sediment can enter the water, affecting water quality and affecting aquatic biodiversity. We also know that it has an impact on fungal communities in the soil. Balsam bashing is the best way to tackle it. It is easy to pull or uproot by hand because it has a shallow root, and you basically grab the root from its lowest point. You should be careful that you remove the whole plant. It would be best to wait until June when it's at a certain height and is easier to pull, but you should try and pull it before it has flowered. Once you've it pulled, you then snap the root. You may have to repeat these steps in August as there may be new growth. And once you have pulled the plant, you just leave that material to the side, and that will dry out and degrade. Rhododendron is mainly associated with woodlands, sometimes on bogs, but many people may also have it in their garden. It is grows up to 5 meters in height. It's an evergreen shrub, and it has dull green waxy leaves. It also has very nice pink purple flowers. Um, so how does it spread? So again, this plant can produce a huge number of seeds, so 1 million seeds annually, and it also the branches can root when they make contact with the ground. Again, it's a very problematic plant which forms dense canopies, and this will shade out native species, and it also produces chemicals so that nothing else can grow around it. So how do we manage rhododendron? So it's recommended that you use mechanical methods before applying chemical treatment. So the stem can be cut close to the ground, but not so close that you would lose track of it. You then apply the herbicide directly to that cut surface, and that needs to be done as soon as possible after cutting. Delaying the application will reduce effectiveness of the treatment. Alternatively, the stumps can be drilled and the herbicide can be applied to the drilled hole. Giant rhubarb, another invasive that we sometimes see along farms. Again, quite a large plant. It grows up to 2 meters, and it has these large umbrella-shaped leaves that are like rhubarb that measure 1.5 meters across. It has reddish leaf stalks that are covered in bristles and spines, and its flower is a tall cone-like structure that can grow up to 1 meter. So how is it spread? So it can produce from small fragments, and each plant produces 250 seeds annually. It grows in dense clumps, which can block out native plants, and it can even block drains and streams. So to manage the species, it would be best to remove the flower head as early as possible before the seeds get a chance to germinate, and herbicide can be applied at the end of the growing season. Winter heliotrope is another invasive that we see sometimes along hedgerows or soil banks. It's a much smaller plant. It's short, perennial herb. It only grows up to about 3 centimeters in height, and it has kidney-shaped leaves with a downy underside. And around this time of year, you'll see that it produces white or lilac flowers that have a strong almond or vanilla scent. How does it spread? So, like the rhododendron, it has rhizomes, which are underground stems through which it spreads. And again, it can form dense carpets, which will exclude native plants. So, to management, you can shade it out, which may subdue the growth. If you only have a small area of infestation, it could be dug out. But for larger infestations, chemical treatment is more effective. It would be important to avoid moving any of the soil, as the plant can reroot from the tiny fragments that are transported. So it's not only invasive plants that can arrive on your farm, there are also some insects and invertebrates that can be an issue. So one to look out for would be the New Zealand flatworm. So the flatworm is dark purple brown in color and is pale underneath. It has a smooth ribbon-like body, but it doesn't have any segments like you'd associate with earthworms. And it is pointed at both ends. Measures 1 centimeter across and can reach up to 20 centimeters in length. And you'll usually find it coiled and covered in sticky mucus when it's at rest. So how does it spread? So it produces egg capsules that resemble black currants. These are laid year-round, but primarily in spring. And you will often find the flatworm in potted plants or growing media. That's usually where you'll find it. And unfortunately, the flatworm preys on our native earthworms, and this can have knock-on impacts for soil health. So obviously, on your farm, you want to maintain soil health, so you don't really want to have the species here. So it is important to be on the lookout for it. And we are getting lots of records around the country of it, and it has been reported on farms previously. So what to do if you come across a New Zealand flatworm? So it's important when you get any plants in from a garden centre or a co-op or a shop or that you examine them and check for the flatworm. If you do come across one, you should take a clear photo. It would be important to inform the source, so the shop or the garden centre where you got the plant. And we would appreciate if you could report any sightings to us at the National Biodiversity Data Centre. It's recommended that you destroy the flatworm and any eggs that you find. And you should check your garden and farm regularly for the species. So just spend 10 minutes checking for it. It's usually found in dark places, so under wood, stones, or underneath plant pots. And there's just a YouTube video there that called Pot Watch if you want to learn more about the invasive flatworm. So unfortunately, there are also invasive pathogens that can have serious impacts on farms. I'm sure most of you will know about ash dieback at this stage. It is a serious disease of ash trees that's caused by an invasive fungal pathogen. And we see that the foliage will start to wilt and discolor, and there will be brown-orange discoloration of the bark that appears in a diamond shape. We see dieback of the shoots, twigs, and main stem, which results in crown dieback, and necrotic lesions and cankers can appear along the bark of the branches or the main stem. And often you will see with a tree that has ash dieback, there will be excessive side shoots along the main stem. When a tree does succumb to ash dieback, there is a risk that it will fall, and it could potentially fall onto a road. So as the landowner, you are responsible for the management of that tree. But it's important to remember, if you are felling any trees, that you do this outside the nesting bird season. Fire blight is also another invasive pathogen, and it's a very concerning issue for farms. It's a bacterial disease that's commonly associated with hawthorn, cotoneaster, and some fruit trees. And obviously, we know that hawthorn is one of the most common hedgerow species in Ireland. So if it was to take hold on your farm, I mean, it could completely wipe out the hedgerows because it can't be treated, and affected trees must be destroyed. Symptoms include withering of the shoots and leaves, and it develops cankers, and you can kind of see this bacterial ooze appear from those. It's been known to come in through latent infections on imported plants, and we've seen that in Germany, it caused the removal of over 800 kilometers of hedgerows. If you do suspect fire blight, very important that you make contact with DAFM and email plantandpests@agriculture.gov.ie. So just some tips about managing invasive species. So it's important to be vigilant, get to know what species you have on your farm. If you do encounter invasives on your farm, don't delay in management so that you can reduce the cost and difficulty of eradication. Be mindful of the risks of further spread. Try to avoid unnecessary disturbance. This is just in general on your farm, because disturbed ground is more likely to be colonized by invasive species. Take informed, responsible actions. Make sure you're following the regulations. It's important to consider biosecurity measures to prevent introduction and spread. Research removal methods and develop site-specific plans. And you may want to seek professional advice from an environmental consultant. You should consider working with neighbours to control species that occur along catchments or adjacent land. Try to use chemicals as a last resort. Only plant native species and those that have been sourced and grown within Ireland. Avoid wildflower mixes, because there's a risk that you will import invasive species to the farm through these. It's best to leave areas just to naturally generate, but if you do require cover, try to use a certified seed mix. So we do have lots of management resources on our website that you might want to take a look at, but it's just, you need to be conscious that some of these don't take into account Irish authorizations, and you may have to apply for licenses through the National Parks and Wildlife Service. So just a bit on hedgerow management. So it's important to consider invasive species when managing hedgerows. So we know that hedgerows and other natural boundaries can actually act as a barrier which limit the spread of invasive species. But on the other side of the coin, they may also facilitate spread, or they may have been the source of the initial arrival of an invasive species on your farm. So it would be important to check hedgerows before they are cut. Ensure that you have the correct identification before you take action. So you don't want to be wasting time controlling common hogweed, mistaking it for giant hogweed. You should only use spot treatment when using a herbicide to protect the hedgerow. So to do this as well, you can create a buffer zone so that you avoid non-target areas. And please don't plant any invasive hedge species such as sycamore, snowberry, rhododendron, and cherry laurel. If you want more guidance on managing hedgerows, I'd recommend that you visit the pollinators.ie website, and they have a resource there on how to manage your hedgerows for pollinators. So we know that riparian areas are very susceptible to invasive species. If you are managing species in the riparian zone, try to use mechanical means first and before you use chemicals. Herbicides that you use should be approved for use near water. And you should these should only be used by trained professionals in a safe and targeted manner. Dispose of your containers responsibly, and care should be taken when washing equipment or machinery to ensure that herbicides don't end up in the water. So biosecurity on the farm. So we know that moving soil, vegetation, forage, seed, and even farm machinery between sites and different parts of your farm risks the spread of invasive species. Practicing good biosecurity is key to effective management and preventing further spread. So it's important that you check and clean machinery and gear before moving between sites. And you should also adhere to procedures for moving soil and like topsoil. So you check for the presence of invasive species before commencing any work, and manage the risk, put a plan in place, have lists for visual inspection checks. So you need to clean your equipment and machinery, and you need to dispose of material responsibly. And also, it would be important just to keep up to date on measures for biosecurity. Also, we recommend that people be plant wise, so know what you're growing. Don't choose the right plants, and don't buy invasive plants, because unfortunately, some of these invasive plants are still for sale. Stop the spread. So the plants that are in your garden, keep them in your garden. Don't let them escape. And it's important to compost with care. So dispose of any unwanted plants, roots, weeds, and seeds responsibly, making sure that nothing gets into the wild. So we would really appreciate that if you could report any sightings of invasive species to our website. We have an online form at invasives.ie where you can report it there. Please include a photo, as this will help us verify the record. We are also asking that if you are taking any action on invasive species, so you may be controlling a plant, or you might be implementing a biosecurity plan on your farm, that you would log this as an action on our online platform called Actions on Invasives. And this is an online mapping system, which basically it lets us track the work that's being done on invasive species around the country. So just a bit on some useful resources. So we have a regulated plant guide, which can help you identify the regulated plant species, and that's available on our website. And we have a second edition coming out very soon. The Farmland Plant Key, which was produced for acres, is also a great source of information for some of the common farmland invasive species. And I'd also recommend picking up the Farming for Nature handbook if you haven't already done so, because it has some useful advice for managing invasive species on your farm. So thank you for listening. So the key message today is to be vigilant for invasive species and take action if needed. You can visit our website for more information, or you can send us an email. Please do report your sightings and log your actions. And I'll take some questions.
Kate, thank you very much. That was very comprehensive and really interesting, and also a little bit worrying as well. Some of the stuff that we have to deal with, it's not just one or two problems, it's multiple problems, and it seems that it's hard to get a handle on it. And I'd just like to thank everybody, all the viewers. There's loads of really, really good questions coming in, so it's going to keep yourself and Ivan busy now shortly. But just to kick off with, there's one thing that really jumped out at me. We're an environmental webinar, and we often talk about climate change, warming temperatures. Is there some sort of a strategy or plan in place to almost like keep an eye out on? You talked about you're talking about plant species, you're talking about invertebrates, you're talking about bacterias, funguses. Are we watching what could potentially come in with climate change, and on top of that, traveling cross borders?
Yes, so there are some biosecurity measures that are in place for invasive species that may come into Ireland. And we do have a system here at the data centre for monitoring species that are recorded. So we get alerted to any of the problematic invasive species. And that's why it's so important that people do send in their records, because that alerts us to what's here. And yeah, you're right, with climate change, habitats are changing, and it could be more possible for other species to arrive here and survive, ones that wouldn't have previously. And there's a lot of research being done at that at the moment. And I think there will be policy developed from that research, hopefully in the future.
Yeah, and the good thing, right, if you're talking to a farmer audience, I think the good thing is our farmers understand biosecurity, because our farmers are used to pests, they're used to brucellosis, TB, they're used to BSE. They understand these things. So this is just on a mass scale. The one thing the question when you're going through all these is, are we how good are we at monitoring these, and what are our trends like? Are we getting better? Are we getting worse? Or how are we doing?
Yeah, I think we see over the years that we get more and more records of these species, and I think that's down to education. People are more aware of species, particularly like Japanese knotweed. So we saw in 2024 that was the most recorded species, and you can see why, because of the road signs. It's there, it's obvious, people can recognize it. So it is about education and getting people familiar with these species and being able to identify them. So I do see that we get more reports of these species at certain times of the year, like summertime, obviously, when plants are in flower, they're easy to recognize. We get a lot of reports of Asian hornet, which is an invasive species that obviously aren't Asian hornet, but people can get confused between some of our native sawflies and wasps and confuse these for Asian hornets. But it's good that people are being vigilant. So I do see that our trends and monitoring are getting better over time.
Yeah, when you mentioned the Asian hornet, the first thing that cropped to my mind when you were talking was the grey squirrel, and then the
Yeah,
hybrid squirrel that came in after it. And you have a problem and you look for a solution, but the solution could potentially make things worse or better. Depends on it. You have to really be careful.
exactly. Yeah.
Ivan, loads of questions coming in, so I'll let you throw a few out there.
Yeah, a lot of questions, and maybe just to follow on two that was mentioned there to get started. One is just on the statistics around the frequency of invasive species on farms that, particularly with a lot of Irish farms, would be intensively managed. So the abundance, it would be presumed by this list or this viewer that it wouldn't be as high in that situation. And secondly, I suppose it's come in a good few times, so maybe to deal with it at an early stage. Why are some of these plants that you have mentioned available for sale through garden centres?
Yeah, I mean, I think with that, it's down to enforcement. So we need to see the authorities actually enforcing the legislation that we have. So we just need to get better at that. That would be the role of the National Parks and Wildlife Service would be to enforce the legislation. So we need to see more checks in garden centres. The new regulations came in summer 2024. So hopefully these will strengthen the case there for enforcement and taking action on shops and garden centres that are selling these invasive species. And as you said, it's really important to tackle these issues really early. So if you do see something arrive on your farm, don't delay and get on and tackle it at an early stage.
Just on that, and you mentioned that education is the way to go. The first step is the people need to, farmers need to, I suppose, be able to identify those plants, or it might be the likes of advisors going on to farms that they're able to identify what's there. If that's the first step, what would be the second step for farmers? Because for a lot of farmers, this is a new area. They're not clear. There's a lot of different bodies working in this space. What are the steps that will say if they do identify it and they're going to your website? What would you recommend as the next step? Because it has come in a few times that the risk of doing further harm. So if you're going cutting or you're going in excavating, if it's not done in the right way, there's really a risk there.
Yeah, I think it's very important that you seek help and you seek professional advice. And I suppose some landowners might be concerned about doing that because of the costs, but the ultimate aim is to eradicate the problem. And if you leave it or you do it incorrectly, that could make it worse. So it would be important once you've identified something and you're sure that you have it, that you seek professional advice from environmental consultant, and they can put in place specific management plan for your farm. And because some farmers might try and tackle it by themselves, and that's fine. If you can use herbicides and you're trained in that way, that's fine. But many other people would rather just go to a professional to get it.
Is there a list of approved professionals working in this area?
We don't have a list of approved ones, but there's tons of different environmental consultancies around Ireland that are specialised in identifying and treating invasive species. I mean, we at the data centre can't put forward any of names. We can't recommend any names, but a quick Google search and you'll be able to find several different companies that manage invasive species, and some of them do it on a very large scale.
Okay. Regarding you mentioned, a lot of different agencies and stuff working. So we'll say on the acre side now, you have your CP teams. We'll say around water, there's the Law Pro, there's local authorities and so on. Is there enough of work, or is there good work going on there regarding coordination between the different groups so that the people are talking to each other and working together?
I think it could be better. So we see now that there is a lot of funding being put into management of water quality, and we see with giant hogweed that is actually a water quality issue. And I have seen recently that there has been projects proposed to manage the species and improve water quality, but we don't see a lot of buy-in from landowners when these schemes are put out there. And I think if the different groups coordinated on these issues, the acres advisors work with Law Pro or the other advisors to make sure that farmers are aware of the benefits of getting involved in these projects, and then actually getting involved in tackling them. So there definitely could be better coordination between the different groups.
Another one there that came in on fire blight. How big of a risk is it? I think someone said, has it the potential to be ash dieback too? Is that the level, or and then connected to that, one of the questions was, why are we still importing, whitethorn?
Yeah, we shouldn't be importing any of these species. We should be sourcing our hedgerow species within Ireland, and that's why these invasives will keep getting in, because we're importing plants from abroad, and there isn't enough checks done on the material that's coming in. I do think with fire blight, there's a risk there. If you're looking for kind of more information on how to maybe like prevent it getting into your farm, I would look to DAFM and the plant health section of DAFM, because they would have good advice there. But I mean, it's a massive risk, and we see that like hawthorn is the one of the most widespread species on Irish farms. So it's a really serious issue. I do think there's a big risk, and I think we need to take it seriously.
There's a few comments regarding it was in the presentation regarding the use of herbicides. That should the dealing with these plants be looked at in a more holistic way, the potential of it to get into our water, and so on. Any comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, as I said in the presentation, you should look at mechanical means before chemical treatment if possible, but there are some certain species where it's just not possible to get rid of them at this stage without herbicides. Um, I mean, some people will suggest using, goats and things like that to control invasive species, but often we see that they can like spread it further. So unfortunately, at the moment, we don't have a lot of other solutions other than herbicide, but there are herbicides that we can use near water, particularly glyphosate-based ones. But it's all about how you're using it, and to be sure that it's a professional, someone who's trained professionally to use it, and that again, you consider spot treatment or stem injection, which is more environmentally friendly and can protect our waterways from these herbicides.
Okay. Well, for invasive species plants that may end up in recycling plants, is there a risk that the remaining seeds could be transferred via compost?
Yes,
So,
there is. And actually, in the data center, my colleague Coletta Flynn is doing a piece of work with the National Botanic Gardens, looking into measures on compost and advising people what to do. So we will have more guidance on that probably in the next few months about what people should do so that invasive species aren't surviving and spreading further when you do put them into compost. So keep an eye out for that.
you mentioned the Asian hornet there. There's a comment here that that it is an issue, and that is there a plan in place to alert, would say, where it is identified correctly? Is there a plan in place to alert and inform farmers, schools, the general public on the threat?
Yeah, so we have had one reported, a verified record of Asian hornet about 2 years ago, and thankfully it was only that one specimen, and it was actually in the process of dying when it was found. So since then, there is a contingency plan being developed for Asian hornet that will be specific to Ireland. And so my colleagues at the data centre are working on that, and they are talking to people in Great Britain and the Channel Islands, where Asian hornet has already established, on plans for Ireland and how we can keep it out of the country. But if it does come here, what we need to do and who would be responsible for tackling it. Obviously, I know a lot of beekeepers are concerned about Asian hornet because they are known to prey on bees, but they also prey on wild pollinators as well. So it's something that we wouldn't really want to see here. But there's also the possibility that it may not establish if it came here. Our climate is quite different to the rest of Europe and even Great Britain. So the important thing is that we have the contingency plan in place, and that we have a plan if there is one report here, because with the movement of people and goods, it is more likely that it could arrive here than not, but it's just about what we do when it gets here.
Okay, so on that movement that you spoke about, um, like we're joined with Northern Ireland, and we have lots of access points to England and to Europe. Is there border controls in place at all, or if they are they strict enough? If you look at countries like New Zealand, who've had detrimental issues, and we're in a similar, we're on an island, so we could potentially have good border controls, but are they in place? And if not, why not?
So we don't have specific checks for invasive species at our borders. So I do think that's something that we're lacking. We don't have the same measures that they have in New Zealand and Australia here. So that is something that we need to look into developing and see how we can do that. It is difficult because we're part of the European Union and we have open borders with fellow member states. So it's a bit trickier in Ireland to have the same amount of checks. But we are in Ireland here, which would mean it should be easier to keep these things out. But no, we need to be doing more on our borders.
Yeah, my concern, and it's come up in the questions there, that the likes of the New Zealand flatworm, and I have a soil background, so earthworms and farmers love earthworms, and they understand
Yeah.
the huge importance that earthworms play on our farms, and without them, we'd be in serious trouble. And now we have a predator coming in that's going to gobble them up. That's a serious concern, and there was a question or a comment saying that it's easier to control them on the way in than control them when they're in the land, because I know you mentioned in your presentation we should go out and check, but the reality is that a lot of farmers aren't going to go out and check, and even if they did look, they wouldn't know what they're looking at, maybe.
That's it. I suppose all you can really do is if you're bringing anything into the farm, that you check it before you open up if you're bringing in compost or soil or any kind of plants that you might need on the farm. But so do the checks yourself on the way in. But I mean, it's very usually these when they arrive to a garden in particular, they are spotted quite quickly. People notice them. So if you had it in your garden or your farm, you probably would have come across it. I mean, they're not that hard to identify. They're quite different to our earthworms and other flatworms. So there's also another invasive flatworm, an Australian one as well, that's more orange in color. But it's important just to be vigilant and just check the material that's coming into your farm.
Yeah, and there's no, and I know we've spoken about pesticides a bit here today and herbicides, and it's not something we want to use when we're looking after biodiversity and environment. But is there a way to I assume there's no way to deal with the likes of those flatworms without actually extracting them physically.
Yeah, the way to tackle them is really just is to squish them, or you
Yeah,
can put them into hot or very salty water. But I'm not aware of any pesticides or anything like that that you could put in the
without
ground.
harming everything else. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah, exactly. That's it. Yeah.
A comment here from Joanna Conn, Acres Burn CP project manager, that the Acres action, landscape action, should hopefully soon be available for the management of invasive species on farms. So they're still working on costings and spec and so on, but hopefully that'll be out shortly in 2025. And that, if farmers have invasive species on their land, are in a CP area and are interested in tackling the area, that they should contact their CP teams, where they will get good information and support on how to tackle invasives on the farms. I think that's ties in well with what you're talking about today, Kate.
That's great. That's fantastic to hear.
Just a question: are farms that are running alongside state-owned land are under a lot of pressure from invasives? One of our viewers mentions here, and that has been similar comments around, issues with local authority land and so on, and who should people contact, and that it probably goes back to that everyone feels that there's too much emphasis put on the farmer. So I don't know if you have any comment on that.
Yeah, so I suppose, as I've said, the landowner is responsible, but also the state landowners are responsible. So for public land, I mean, it's the responsibility of the local authority. If it's a national park, it's the responsibility of the National Parks and Wildlife Service. So if you have an issue where there is maybe something like rhododendron and it's encroaching on your land from state-owned land, it would be important to report that. There is the wildlife enforcement section of the National Parks and Wildlife Service is where you can report that, just to make them aware of it, because the only way it can be tackled is if it's reported, and just keep on it. I know it's hard sometimes when you don't get a response, but we see that sometimes maybe there isn't enough management being done at a state level, but that shouldn't discourage farmers from not undertaking management, because at the end of the day, it's in the legislation that you are responsible for looking after this, and you don't want to face penalties down the line. But we would say first instance, it's also better for your farm because invasive species impact on biodiversity. They crowd out native species, and native species are what we need for the invertebrates, and invertebrates are what we need for the soil. It's all linked in. So at the end of the day, if you're letting something spread on your farm, it's only going to impact the functioning of your farm in the long run. So it's just best to deal with it at an early stage.
There's a group I'm aware of in Connemara, that the Dooler project. I don't know if you're aware of them, but where local people are trained up, and they're dealing with fairly large area of rhododendron predominantly out there. Do you see benefits of community groups like this and scope for more of that?
Absolutely. I mean, it's the best way to do it really because a lot of these infestations are quite large, and the more people you have involved, the better. I mean, there's a great kind of social aspect to it as well. I've seen a group in Kildare in the Ballymore Eustace Environmental Group, and they have come together and they're tackling balsam along the River Liffey together, and they found that it was a great social thing to get together and do something good, and it's obviously have a positive impact for the river. I mean, it's the same for any other groups, and I think as well I think the Dualar group, I think they might be doing a lot of work on rhododendron, and I mean, you need numbers, you need people, so yeah, it's fantastic, and I definitely recommend people getting involved, local groups that are tackling invasive species.
Very good, yeah. A few questions come in. It was you mentioned earlier was on the whole area around herbicides, and I suppose there's just questions on where do you go to find out what's the right concentration to use, what's the risk to water where those invasives are grown near to water, what I suppose people taking care and so on. Other than that type of in-depth kind of very specific information where you're talking about concentrations for a plant. Is that available on your website, or where should people go for that? Or are you at that stage, are you talking about bringing in outside expertise?
Yeah, you'd be talking about outside expertise there because, I mean, you really should be trained in the use of these. I mean, and also you need to be aware of the sustainable use of pesticides, and I know there's legislation on that. So it really would be for a trained professional, but I do know that some farmers have that training. But for specific advice, it probably would be the best to talk to the experts about the concentrations because you don't want to be using too much. I mean, there is some guidance on our website that you can take a look at, but I don't think it goes into the detail of how much herbicide that you should use per plant.
Yeah. Is there I suppose we'll say for farmers, there's a comment here. This, I think at some place in the presentation you mentioned contacting DAFM, and then in other scenarios around legislation, you're talking about contacting NPWS, and then it's the National Biodiversity Data Centre. I suppose the question, and it has come up once or twice. Should there be one centralised place for people to go to, because it's complicated. It is a complicated area, even dealing with all the different types of plants and species. But that I suppose people get overwhelmed about who is the right port to call it for a given occurrence.
Yeah, so usually if it's a plant pest or a pest that will have an impact on agriculture, I would advise contacting DAFM because they kind of manage those species. Also at the data center, we collect data and provide information on invasive species, which are usually the invasives that will be impacting on biodiversity or just, the way we live and the economy and things like that. And then above us then would be the National Parks and Wildlife Service, which would be enforcing the legislation. So if you've specific queries about the regulations, it'd be best to go to National Parks and Wildlife Service if it's related to invasive species. But plant pests and pests that are I'm thinking like fire blight and ash dieback, it would be better to go to DAFM to discuss those. Yeah.
Okay, so is there an app or a tool or something that farmers could use to identify different species?
I mean, we do have good resources on our website. We don't currently have an app, but it may be something that we might develop in the future. Some of the resources I mentioned already, like our plant guide, are very useful, particularly for the regulated species. And I mean, I would highly recommend picking up a copy of that from our online shop because that has the ones that you need to be concerned about. Like knotweed and hogweed, and it shows you how to identify them. But yeah, maybe in the future we will have an app that can help people identify them too.
for someone like me that's not good at species identification, to take a photo and for it to come back and tell me what it is very useful. And I'm sure there's lots more like me.
Yeah, and I would say that if people do have queries about identification, they can always email us at the data center, and we will, if we can't identify ourselves, we have a list of experts that we go to. So definitely recommend emailing us at the data center if you have, if you're not sure about something. Yeah.
Just on the identification, there was one question or comment was just in regard that there's two species of Gunnera. One is in fact a hybrid, and it's just to be aware of the differences, that one of them is not an invasive. And the second comment was in relation to winter heliotrope looking like coalsfoot. How do we tell the difference?
Yeah, so just back to the Gunnera there. So the one I discussed today is Gunnera tinctora, I think that's how it's called. And then the other one is Gunnera mancata. So there has been some hybridization. I think there is research being done in UCD on that to see, is it the potential of it being invasive? But at the moment, we're saying that the mancata one isn't invasive. Just with coalsfoot, I'm not actually that familiar with coalsfoot. I would say if you want to identify, if you think you might have winter heliotrope, do check out our website for our guide on how to identify it, because there's good information there. Or if you just want to send us a picture and I can let you know, but I'm not particularly familiar with coalsfoot, so I don't want to say something wrong there.
Regarding Mount Brasha, really bad in waterways and for destabilizing riverbanks, why is it not classified as an invasive?
Yeah, so I suppose a number of these species that are regulated, so sorry, I should say actually Mount Brasha is an invasive species, but it's not a regulated invasive species. And that is because a number of years ago, there were risk assessments done on these invasive species to see what level of impact they would have. At the time, the risk assessment said that Mount Brasha was not a high impact species and therefore it wasn't regulated. That's not to say in the future that it might become a regulated species, but while it isn't one at the moment, we can't enforce or recommend that people do anything about it. But there are things you can do. I mean, if you have it in your garden, you can dig it up and eradicate it that way. But obviously, we see it along roadways, particularly down. I know, like in Kerry and Cork, you see a lot of it along the roadways there, and like that's a landscape level type of management that you would need, and it would be, if it's on a roadway, it's in the realm of the county council. And while it's not a regulated species, there's nothing to say for them to do anything about it.
I think we have time for one more, I'd say, Ivan, if you want.
I suppose looking at kind of, because obviously in certain areas, as people say, I know an area very familiar with Connemara, will say where it takes up huge areas. But you mentioned that the possibility of dealing with invasives on a catchment basis. How would you think this could be rolled out, and what would be the key actions here? Maybe it's kind of a broad question, but just thinking of how we could plan ahead.
It's very difficult because on an individual catchment, you could have hundreds of landowners, and LawPro in collaboration with Tipperary County Council are developing this giant hogweed project in southwest Tipperary. And what they've seen is that a lot of the landowners aren't interested in getting involved in the scheme, and they were going to provide all the resources to treat the hogweed along the catchment. So unless you get every landowner along the catchment, it's kind of hard to say that you should do it, because further down the line, if there's still giant hogweed upstream of where you are, it's likely that the seeds will spread and reinfest your land again. But it is the best way to eradicate a species is a catchment approach, but it's just very hard to get landowners involved. And unless you have 100% buy-in, it's not going to be fully effective.
Unfortunately, I think that's all we have time for today. Look, but thank you to everybody for submitting questions. I think that was a very busy session. A lot of questions come in there. Ivan, you've done a great job trying to get through them, but I know, and apologies to the people that we didn't get questions answered. Kate, thanks a million for an excellent presentation and sharing your knowledge. There's several comments that came in just to say how they really enjoyed the presentation and it was excellent. So well done to you. And Ivan, thanks a million for your help on the questions and your knowledge as ever. A hive of information. And in the background, then we're not to forget Yvonne Marr, who's the driving force of the show, working away, keeping us on the straight and narrow, and keeping the show on the road. So that thank you, Yvonne. And look, next week, just to look forward, we're going to chat to Lindsay Winston's Organic Research Centre UK, and Lindsay is going to discuss agroforestry and its benefits for animal health and welfare. So that's not to be missed either. So please do tune in again next Friday at 9:30. But until then, I hope you have a great weekend and slán go fóill.